Burmese pythons have transformed the entire ecosystem of South Florida. After arriving here as seemingly innocent pets, these snakes have overrun their new environment in just a few decades.
In Florida, an experiment that seemed worthy of a joke ended up becoming one of the most controversial and unexpected episodes in the state's recent history. Imagine a government being ridiculed on national television, accused of irresponsibility, of playing with nature as if it were a game. Now imagine that same decision turning, years later, into a phenomenon no one believed was possible. This is the case of the rare snakes that were released in large numbers into Florida's swamps, an act that divided experts, scared the population, and became the target of headlines filled with sarcasm. Except what seemed a grotesque mistake ended up radically changing everyone's perception. What began as mockery would soon become a surprising story of survival, ecological balance, and even scientific redemption. It all began quietly, almost hidden from the general public. Researchers and environmental agencies were desperate in the face of a problem that grew like a shadow over the Everglades: the invasion of Burmese pythons. These giant snakes, brought in through the exotic animal trade and abandoned by careless owners, multiplied to the point of turning the region's ecosystems into true silent cemeteries. Native mammals disappeared, birds that once flew over the area vanished, and even the alligators, the former owners of the swamp, began facing rivals of overwhelming strength. It was an invasion out of control, and nothing the experts tried seemed to work. Hunters were hired to reduce the number of pythons, but for each specimen captured, dozens seemed to appear. Physical barriers, elaborate traps, even public hunts with cash rewards were organized, but nothing seemed to stop the silent and relentless advance of the giant snakes. The situation was so absurd that headlines began to speak of an ecological collapse in slow motion. It was in this chaotic scenario that a group of scientists proposed an idea considered crazy by many. If traditional weapons did not work, perhaps the answer lay in nature itself. The proposal was to release hundreds of specimens of a species that had practically disappeared from Florida decades earlier, the eastern indigo snake. Rare, protected by law, and feared for its imposing presence, this serpent could reach nearly 3 meters in length. But what really drew attention was not the size, but rather its behavior. Unlike the invasive pythons, the indigos do not kill to compete for territory. On the contrary, their menu includes other snakes, including the most dangerous ones. They are immune to rattlesnake venom and, in theory, could hunt and reduce the number of young pythons, those that had not yet reached overwhelming size. When this strategy was revealed, the laughter was immediate. Headlines mocked the decision as a snake war, ordinary citizens said the government had gone mad, and even opposition politicians used the measure as a weapon to ridicule those responsible. After all, who could take seriously the idea of releasing more snakes in a state already plagued by giant serpents? For many, it seemed a recipe for disaster, another anecdote reinforcing Florida's image as a bizarre place where reality surpasses fiction. But behind the scenes, far from the noise of public opinion, the scientists were convinced they had in their hands one of the last possible cards. They knew the pythons would not be defeated by human traps, because they reproduced at an accelerated pace and dominated entire ecosystems. They needed a natural predator, a force capable of restoring part of the lost balance. And so the first indigos began to be bred in captivity, prepared to be reintroduced into the swamps where they had once been abundant. The operation was kept relatively secret, but as the first groups of indigo snakes were released, rumors began circulating. Some believed the scientists were only feeding an even bigger problem. Others said it was a show to justify millions in environmental program spending. And some, the most skeptical, bet that the indigos simply would not survive in an environment already taken by larger and more aggressive predators. But then, something unexpected happened. Researchers began noticing signs that the swamps were changing in subtle ways. Trails of animals that had vanished began reappearing. Small mammals were once again sighted in areas where for years, only the marks of pythons were seen. And most intriguingly, signs of confrontations between indigos and invasive serpents began appearing in field analyses. What seemed a joke was slowly turning into an experiment with unpredictable results. The scientific world watched divided. Some celebrated the boldness of the measure, others remained skeptical, warning it was too soon to declare victory. But for the first time in decades, there was a spark of hope. And that hope would come accompanied by even more surprising revelations, which would make even the harshest critics reconsider their opinion of Florida's boldness. As months went by, the measure that had been ridiculed gained even more controversial contours. Ordinary citizens, landowners, and even environmental organizations began questioning whether the government had not created a double problem. Pythons on one side and now indigos released without control. The fear of a new ecological imbalance spread. On local radio, jokes circulated every day: if Florida cannot handle alligators, how will it handle giant snakes fighting each other? That was the atmosphere of skepticism and irony. Except behind the cameras, the scientists continued recording data, cataloging sightings, and analyzing behavioral patterns that few knew. The indigos, contrary to what many expected, not only survived, they thrived. They adapted to the swamps with surprising speed, found territories, and began moving into areas where pythons once dominated. One curious detail left researchers intrigued: the diet of indigo snakes was even more diverse than imagined. In addition to small mammals and birds, they did not hesitate to hunt local venomous serpents, rattlesnakes, and cottonmouths, reducing the threat of fatal encounters for humans. But what really drew attention was the amount of young pythons found in stomach content analyses. It was the first concrete evidence that the plan, however bold, was working. These results began being presented at scientific conferences. Suddenly, that project once ridiculed began attracting international attention. Researchers from other countries wanted to understand how a rare, almost forgotten snake could play such a crucial role in a devastated ecosystem. Except with the interest also came pressure. Animal rights groups protested, accusing scientists of using the snakes as disposable tools in a dangerous game of environmental manipulation. Some even claimed Florida had opened Pandora's box and that the effects could be irreversible. Meanwhile, in the swamps, what was really happening was much more silent and far more impressive. Monitoring cameras captured scenes few would believe without seeing: indigos chasing smaller pythons in quick, lethal ambushes. Footage of confrontations circulated among specialists, but took time to reach the public, which still viewed the project with suspicion. When some of these recordings began leaking, the reaction was immediate. The laughter that once dominated headlines gave way to a mix of fascination and unease. For the first time, people began realizing that maybe boldness had reason. But this new scenario brought another dilemma. If indigos truly were controlling the population of young pythons, what would happen when these rare snakes multiplied excessively? Was Florida unknowingly creating a new superpopulation that could escape control? These questions began echoing in heated debates among experts and environmentalists. The detail is that by this moment, scientists had already discovered something even more intriguing. Indigos did not reproduce at the same rapid rate as pythons. Their breeding cycle was slow, and the survival rate of hatchlings was much lower. This, in theory, prevented them from becoming a threat through overpopulation. In other words, it was as if nature had designed this species to act as a regulator, predatory enough to curb imbalance, but not numerous enough to create another problem. This discovery changed the tone of conversations. Gradually, public perception began to shift. What once seemed like an insane idea started being seen as a bold but intelligent strategy. Headlines that once mocked Florida began using terms like successful experiment and hope for the Everglades. And there was still another aspect that made the story even more fascinating: the symbolism. The indigo snake, which had been practically exterminated from the region by human action, now returned as protagonist of a battle for the survival of the entire ecosystem. It was as if nature were taking silent revenge, using precisely one of its forgotten creatures to restore lost balance. The turning point, however, was still to come. Because amid this apparent success, reports began emerging of increasingly frequent encounters between locals and these rare snakes. And contrary to the expected fear, many described the experiences as almost enigmatic: an immense creature bluish in color with metallic shine, moving calmly, without attacking, but carrying an aura of imposing presence difficult to explain. These accounts spread quickly, transforming the indigo snake from feared villain into symbol of respect. And it was precisely this unexpected aspect, the change in human perception of the serpent, that would set the stage for the most surprising outcome of all, something even the harshest critics could not ignore. When the first evidence appeared, many still called it coincidence. 2 baby indigo snakes were found deep in Florida's wilderness, born not in laboratories or captivity, but in the wild. They were living proof that the species was not only surviving but had resumed its natural cycle, something that had not happened there in more than 4 decades. For the scientists who had followed the project from the beginning, the moment was described as historic. It was not just the birth of 2 snakes, but the rebirth of hope. This discovery spread rapidly through academic circles and within days, reached the news. The same outlets that once printed headlines mocking Florida now carried very different titles. The Return of the Lost Guardian, or Nature Responds to Risk with Balance. The laughter had turned into recognition. And the results did not stop there. Farmers began noticing a visible drop in the number of venomous snakes on their lands. Families reported it was safer to walk through rural areas without the same fear of fatal encounters. Crops also reflected the change. Indigos, eating excess rodents, reduced losses that had once devastated entire plantations. The impact was real, not just theoretical or in laboratories. Even more surprising was the discovery that these silent predators played an unexpected role against one of the region's greatest problems: Burmese pythons, invaders devastating local fauna. Juveniles of these giants were captured and eliminated by indigos before reaching sizes that made them nearly untouchable. It was as if nature itself had found, in its deepest memory, a way to resist collapse. Suddenly, Florida, once ridiculed, began to be watched with respect. Similar projects gained space in neighboring states. In Alabama, for example, the strategy was replicated, and years later, indigo hatchlings were also found born in the wild. The initiative stopped being an isolated gamble to become a model of ecological recovery throughout the region. But the impact was not only ecological. The figure of the indigo snake gained an almost symbolic aura. Its bluish color, shining under the light as if made of liquid metal, became an emblem of resilience. For many, it represented proof that even the most degraded ecosystems can recover when one trusts the strength of nature itself. Curiously, despite its imposing size, reaching over 8 feet in length, the indigo is harmless to humans. It has no venom, avoids confrontation, and prefers retreat at the first sign of threat. The contrast between its almost intimidating appearance and peaceful behavior only reinforced the shift in public perception. What was once feared began to be respected. In little time, schools and environmental centers started using the indigo as an example in educational programs, showing new generations that it is not a monster but a vital piece of natural balance. And so, the narrative reversed. What began as a joke ended as a scientific and cultural triumph. What was called madness turned into a global reference. Florida had taken a risk, and the result went beyond expectations. It was not merely the victory of a rare animal, but of an entire mentality. The idea that bold solutions, even mocked at the start, can be exactly what the planet needs to recover. The most intriguing part, however, lies not only in the present. It lies in what this experience represents for the future. If an apparently impossible project managed to restore balance to one of America's most threatened ecosystems, what would prevent other species, in other parts of the world, from having the same chance? Florida was mocked for releasing hundreds of rare snakes. But in the end, it was those very snakes that showed the fight against environmental collapse is not lost. They transformed scorn into respect, doubt into results, and became a disturbing reminder: when we give it space, nature finds ways to defend itself. And the question that remains is inevitable: if the solution to so many of our greatest problems already exists hidden within ecosystems themselves, what are we waiting for to listen?